Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Cork, and I'm the Senior Association Manager of iHEA. Welcome to the webinar, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Policy for Early Career Researchers in Health Economics, hosted by the iHEA Early Career Researcher Special Interest Group. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded and uploaded on our website afterwards. The presentation slides will also be loaded on the website after the webinar, so please don't worry if we skim through some of the slides and there isn't a need to take any notes. Before we begin the webinar, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping items. If you experience any technical issues during today's webinar, please write them in the chat box at the bottom right of your screen, and I'll be happy to assist. Everyone on the line has been muted except for the presenter in an effort to eliminate background noise. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat box and they will be addressed by today's moderator. We will also ask everyone to keep their webcams turned off during the webinar. We will be circulating a survey following the webinar to obtain feedback, so we ask that everyone please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. Thank you again, and I will now hand it over to Thorhildur Olafsdottir, today's moderator.
Conveners for the early career. Oh, you can hear me now? Okay. I'm one of the conveners for the early career researchers special interest group. And we're very excited about today's topic, which is on ways to connect research to policy, or in other words, how to put to good use results from quality research. With the numerous findings in health economics, we can guide policymakers on, for example, ways to use resources more efficiently, how to increase general well-being, and on prioritization in healthcare. But this may be more complicated than it sounds. Today's speaker is an expert on this topic. She has served on various government policy bodies and provided policy inputs within South Africa, other African countries, and in international forums. She helped establish the first health economics master's program in Africa and was the founding director of the Health Economics Unit at the University of Cape Town, where she remains as emeritus professor. She now serves as the Executive Director of iHEA since January 2016. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Di McIntyre. Over to you, Di.
Di, are you there?
Sorry, I lost audio for a minute. So, should I just get started?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you heard her, but Thorhildur just introduced you.
Perfect, thank you. Well, welcome everyone to the first webinar organized by the Early Career Researcher Special Interest Group. I'm extremely honored to be asked to present at this webinar. I usually prefer to be very interactive, and so it's a bit strange for me to be in a webinar where I can't see people and I can't hear So I will stop every now and again to see if there are any questions. What I'm going to try to do is to just look at some of the factors that can influence the research to policy process, and also provide some practical tips on communicating about research to policymakers. Now, please understand that it's not going to be comprehensive. There's a very vast literature out there about research to policy processes, and quite a lot of that literature is published or comes from the perspective of the researcher rather than from the perspective of the policymaker. So I'm presenting really from the perspective of the researcher, and I don't think that sufficient research has been done or that we understand well enough how policymakers are able to or not able to use research information. I will try to give some examples along the way, but I'm not going to present big case studies and say, well, we did this and this is how it went and this is how we got it into the research into policy. It'll rather be vignettes just mentioning certain things along the way. The last thing that I'd like to say by way of introduction is that my experience is really more at the macro health system level, which is a little bit different to if one is focusing on a very specific health service and trying to engage with policymakers and implementers at a decentralized level. So that's just sort of by way of background. I just want to check that my audio is okay.
Yeah,
Are
it's
people
perfect.
hearing all right? Okay, perfect. Great. All right, so before looking at the factors affecting the research to policy process, I thought it might be just helpful to briefly raise some issues about policy processes and about some of our assumptions that we have about how things work. And the most important thing to recognize is that it's not a linear process. It would be really wonderful if we as researchers did good research, we got the research out there through disseminating our findings, and the policymakers received this research and they understood it and they just went ahead and acted on the findings. But the reality is that it's a slightly more messy process. And I quite like the idea of this drip, 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 that it's information, it's ideas that gets constantly put into the policy environment. There's an exchange of information between people. But what happens with that information is sometimes unpredictable. So if one is a researcher that is trying to translate your research findings into the policy environment, I think it's always good to give it the best shot you can, but to have modest expectations, because there are a range of factors and stakeholders that can change. The other thing that I think is worthwhile just thinking about briefly, looking at the factors that affect research being translated into policy, is what do we understand by research? I think, often we think of data, etc., but I think it's also important to recognize that research is also about ideas and concepts. And I love this quote from John Lavis. I'll pick up on it again later. It's partly about how one packages the messages, but it is important to recognize that research is not always data, but also about ideas. And I'm just going I'm going to show you a couple of policy briefs. And please don't worry, the whole presentation will be uploaded on a website shortly after the webinar. So please don't worry if you can't see everything exactly. It will be available for you to look at in detail. So this just provides an example of research that is around concepts and ideas. It's something that's very important at the moment in terms of the healthcare financing debates, the whole issue of strategic purchasing for health. And it's an example of a policy brief like this, which just really puts across some concepts and tries to get policymakers to grapple with these concepts and understand what strategic purchasing means. Is quite a useful example of how research can be about ideas and concepts. All right, so now just moving on to some of the factors affecting the uptake of research. And if you look through the literature, and I'll provide some references at the end of the presentation, which you can go and read more yourselves. These are the 4 things that repeatedly come up in the literature, and they're also issues which resonate with my experience of trying to do policy relevant research and translate that research into policy. So what I will do is look at each of them in turn and just unpack them a little bit. But you'll see that I've put the issue of relationships between researchers and policymakers in red at the bottom. And that is because consistently in the literature, and again, it's my own experience, this is one of the absolute critical issues. So I'll spend a little bit more time on that than on the other factors. Okay, so the first issue, the question of that the research should be relevant and it should be timely. Now, what is policy relevant research? Well, when I was thinking about it, really just about all health economics research that I can think of is or has the potential to be policy relevant. There's very little health economics research. It's only if it's purely focused on addressing some methodological issues that it might not be immediately policy relevant. So the key thing is that it's really the issue is that very often the policy relevance is not made explicit. I very often, many of the articles I read and many of the presentations I hear at health economics conferences don't mention the policy relevance. It's really all about the research and how it was done, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is one of the absolutely critical things is if you want your research to be policy relevant, you need to actually make it clear what the policy conclusions are. But the relevance is also an issue in terms of timing, because you might be ahead of your time and looking at issues that policymakers don't really perceive to be a problem at that point. So sometimes the issue that you've got to deal with is actually first making the case that the issue that you're looking at is a problem that needs to be addressed. The other issue in terms of the timeliness of research, the problem often is that policymakers might identify an issue and say, look, this is a problem that we need to address. We need to do some research. We need to have research done about it. But as researchers, we know that there's often quite a big time lag between a problem being identified and the results of the research being available. So it's often policymakers want results before we can deliver them. So it actually helps to be quite proactive and to understand what policymakers' concerns are, to understand what the big issues are, and to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing to identify what might be the next big issues and initiate research on those. Sometimes there are windows of opportunities that arise. So sometimes it's very rare that you're going to be able to predict with certainty when windows of opportunity would arise. Certainly we had that within the South African context, where the ANC was unbanned in 1990, and one could tell that there was going to be major political change, major change in the health sector, etc. And you could actually think clearly about what kind of information is going to be critical if there are going to be changes in the health system. But very often it's more a case of you've done research, you try to put it out in the policy arena, and it's not really taken up that at a particular point in time, it's just the right time for it to be introduced. So to give you an example there, we were doing quite a lot of research around user fees and how that impacted on people's access to health services, how much revenue was being generated, how much it cost to collect that revenue, etc. And had a very strong case that user fees, particularly at the primary healthcare level, should be removed. But we were getting absolutely nowhere with that message. But in 1994, when the new government came in and they set up a policy committee to look at what were the most urgent issues to address within the health sector, because we had the information and the research done, that was a classic window of opportunity that one could use to put that research into the policy space. I think I'm just going to quickly stop for a second and see if there are any questions related particularly particularly to what we've, what I've covered so far. The question about developing relationships between researchers and policymakers comes in just a few minutes. So I'm not going to answer that question now, but are there any other questions that people have about the issues that we've covered so far? If not, I'll just forge ahead. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, but I don't see anything. Okay, so I'm just going to move on quickly. So that looked at the first factor, relevant and timely research. I'm now just going to look at the issue of accessible research. And, you know, one of the key things is that policymakers often don't have time to read journals, and they certainly don't have time to read long research reports. So one of the ways of making research accessible, your research and your research findings accessible, is to produce what are called policy briefs, which are generally 2 to 4 pages long, and they tend to be very useful. And I'm just going to flip through one now that I will talk, or I'll take a couple of examples from just now. And I'm just going to mute because I can hear some. All right. Okay, so this is a policy brief, and what it was about was that there clearly it was recognized that there was a really big problem in terms of the quality of public health services in South Africa, really bad perception of quality of care. And a lot of discussion about, well, how do we go about it? Is it, and there were various hypotheses flying around. Well, people don't like using public sector services because they don't automatically see a doctor, or because waiting times are so long, etc., etc. And so we did a discrete choice experiment, and after that produced this policy brief. And as I say, you will be able to see it later on. It will be on the website. Now, this just hopefully illustrates one of the questions that was sent in beforehand, before the seminar, before the webinar, asked in a presentation, what are the, if I'm presenting to policymakers, what are the kinds of issues I should cover so that I can convince them that this is good evidence, but also get the policy messages across. And my response on that would be to think of it like you were writing a policy brief. But in a policy brief, you always have your key messages or key points right at the top, because quite often that might be the only thing that a policymaker reads. But in general, in a policy brief, in a presentation, you should certainly refer to the methods. I'll explain later that it should be in relatively non-technical terms, but you need to at least say what you did in the research, what the issues were that you were looking at, how you went about it, particularly where you got the information from, but relatively light touch on the methods. In terms of findings, I think in this policy brief, we only covered a couple of key findings. You cannot present all of your research findings or in detail, and you've got to identify what the most important ones are. And making explicit what the findings mean, but also being very open about the limitations of the study. I think it's very important for policymakers to see that you're not saying, listen, this is 100% accurate, but being upfront about where some of the problems might be. So I'm just going to move off this policy brief now, but I'm going to pick up a couple of things from it and just highlight it. So accessible is not only producing information and getting it, say, for example, in a policy brief, and getting it, not just putting it on a website, but actually getting it into the hands of the policymakers that need to see it. You could either send them an email with the policy brief attached saying, I thought that you might be interested in this, and just give a brief introduction. Another good way is to get it, to speak about it in the media, if you get an opportunity to have little pieces in the media. Often policymakers pick up on things that are in the media, but then they want more information about it. So it's useful to have a policy brief that you can, which gives a bit more information about the research. So that's part of the accessibility, is getting the information out there. But the other part of the accessibility issue is not to use jargon. It's one of my big bugbears, but because I find that very often economists use jargon that is unnecessary. We can explain the concepts in simple terms. And so this is now just pulling out one of the things that was in that policy brief on from the DCE. And the message that was or how the findings were explained were in simple language. That the availability of medicines was 10 times to people when one did the DCE. It was from the results, it was 10 times more important than being treated by a doctor as opposed to a nurse. So it's unnecessary to present the logic coefficients or willingness to pay data. And it's just to give you a little anecdote here, many years ago, I think it was about 15, 20 years ago, I was in a meeting, it was linked to a conference, and it was a group of people getting together to chat about the whole issue of research to policy. And the room was filled with mainly researchers, and there were one or two policymakers there. And the one researcher said, you know what the problem is that policymakers, they don't understand what p-value is. And what they need to do, they all need to do statistical courses. They need to understand statistics. And I looked at the couple of policymakers that were in the room, and you could see smoke coming out of their ears. They were absolutely insulted and furious. Anyway, one of the policymakers was a colleague from South Africa, and she said, okay, look, I actually have a master's in public health. I'm an epidemiologist. I have done research. I understand perfectly well what a p-value is. But I do know that many of my colleagues don't know what a p-value is. But what I want to know is why you need to refer to a p-value. Why are you not explaining your research in simple terms? And that really was, that message stuck with me for years and years, that there are different ways of presenting data, visually also, in graphs, in maps, etc., to get the message across that you want to. That you use professional language, but avoid being too technical. And I think it's also important that one should not speak down to policymakers. The policymakers, whether they're reading or listening, they're intelligent, they're not stupid. They're intelligent non-experts. They're not experts in health economics. And it's our job, if we want our message to get across, to actually make it accessible by not using jargon. Now, just in terms of the issue of key messages, that was the third one, is you need to have key messages, and these key messages should be actionable. So I'll come to the actionable bit just now. But something that is quite useful if you're trying to think of well, how do I think about what is the key message? A way to do it is to use this elevator test. If one imagines oneself, you land up in an elevator with the Minister of Health next to you. You've got 1 or 2 minutes in the elevator with the Minister between floors. How do you convey the most important, what is the most important thing you want him or her to understand? And this is, again, just 2 examples from the policy brief I showed you just now. The most important thing that we needed to convey was that if the issue of the availability of medicines in facilities was addressed, it would be a major improvement, and there would be a lot more of an uptake of public health services. And with this first quote, I'm not saying that any poor quality is acceptable, but sometimes issues like long waiting times or poor staff attitudes are much more difficult to deal with. And it was very clear that what people who use facilities valued the most was that if they went, they got the medicine they needed. So, so that's an example of identifying a key message. I'm just aware of time, so I'm not going to talk to the slide, even though I think it's a fascinating thing, but I'm just rather going to move on. And just quickly, I'm not going to go through the whole of this, but this is another policy brief which gives a very good example of when you're making recommendations to policymakers, they need to be actionable. That I often see, particularly in student dissertations, etc., you always have a recommendations section, and very often the recommendations are very broad and not actionable. Now, this is a really good example of an actionable recommendation that came out. It was a study looking at how best to dispense medicines to patients on the antiretroviral program. South Africa has the biggest antiretroviral treatment program in the entire world, and we've got very few pharmacists. So is it better to do it with nurses, or is it better to do it with pharmacy assistants? And it looked at the costs of the different options, etc. It was clear that the better option from a cost perspective, not only the health system cost perspective, but also patients in terms of their time taken to get to facilities, etc., etc. It was better with the pharmacist assistant approach. But there were problems in relation to stigma and confidentiality with how that the pharmacy assistant model was working. And after all of this research, one was able to say, definitely go with the pharmacy assistant model, and that's the one to really develop. But to ensure that there's confidentiality is maintained, etc., remove any antiretroviral service identifiers from patient folders. These might seem like really obvious, but very often people don't see it if they're not in the clinics and they're not seeing that if you're carrying a red folder, everyone knows that you are HIV positive. So these are just examples of actionable messages. So I'm going to just quickly, I think I'm going to just stop for a minute here and just see if there are any questions. I'm just going to have a look in the chat box. And then what I'm going to do is just spend the last 5 minutes or so looking at the issue of relationships between researchers and policymakers. So the one question that has come in, do policymakers use social media? Sometimes, and it's very context specific, but definitely social media is being used more and more. So it's definitely worthwhile tweeting about it. And it is interesting in different contexts. Facebook is used much more than Twitter, but it's definitely worthwhile getting messages out about research. Very often in tweets, the information is sent, or it points people to an article. As I say, I think policy briefs are very useful as a backup, so that if somebody sees a tweet, they know where to find out more about the research. Okay, I don't see any more questions here in the chat box. So I'm just going to plow ahead and then so I can finish the presentation, and then I'll stop and just focus on questions. I feel like I am talking a bit too much, and we should have more discussion. Okay, but this is a key issue around building relationships with policymakers, and these are a couple of the issues that come up in the literature, but also from my own experience. It requires an enormous amount of investment, and it's a long-term. It's a long-term investment. It's not something that's over quickly. You've got to devote a lot of time and energy to it. One of the key things is to be a listener, to understand the concerns of policymakers and implementers. So it is about listening. And obviously, sometimes one doesn't get the opportunity to listen to policymakers directly, but it is good to try to do that, but also to listen to others who have contact with policymakers and implementers. I think it is really, really important to understand policy processes and the policy environment. And I would encourage people to read a little bit about health policy processes, again, talk to those who have experience to get a sense of how it works. Certainly when I first started engaging in policy processes, I had absolutely no clue, and I thought technical information is going to win every time because, I mean, this is the thing that should be done. I mean, from the research, it's clear. This is what we need to do. And was enormously frustrated when, it became clear that there's stakeholders, there are people with vested interests who challenge what you're saying, who will do everything to prevent certain things from happening. So I think it's important to just get a sense of how messy these policy processes can be, and that is not just, I think it's important to understand those. I think it's also important to build legitimacy. You're not going to persuade policymakers that your research is sound through a policy, through the information you include in a policy brief or through a presentation you make. It's something that you have to build over time. It is very important that one has a strong academic foundation, that you publish in peer-reviewed literature. That is part of, if you publish in well-respected journals and it's peer-reviewed, thoroughly peer-reviewed, it helps to build legitimacy. Another really important thing is the funding source of your research, and that helps build legitimacy and also trust. I mean, there's a group in South Africa that is quite active in engaging around policy issues, but they never publish in peer-reviewed journals, and the fact that they're funded by private hospitals, policymakers will just not listen to them. Sorry, I see that I'm taking a very long time, so I'm going to speed up a bit. The last bit is be responsive wherever possible. Once you start developing relationships with implementers, you can be sure that it's not going to be a one-way street, that you're not going to say, look, here's my latest research findings, let me sit down and explain them to you and how you should go about it, etc. They are going to contact you. They will see you also as an information broker. They'll think, Di will know where we can find this information. We're looking for specific information. And it is really important to be responsive. Often one doesn't want to drop everything and help them find that information because the minister wants the information and they're trying to find it. But it helps enormously to be responsive. Just very quickly, it's all fine and well to say, look, build these relationships with policymakers, with implementers, but I mean, how do you get to meet them? And I think one of the very under-recognized areas is the relationship between teaching and policy. That if you have the opportunity to teach on courses which include practitioners, include policymakers as learners, it's a fabulous opportunity to actually get to engage, to develop relationships, it can provide very valuable openings, but also if you're teaching in an interactive way, you're hearing what they're saying, you're able to identify, okay, these are the sort of policy concerns, these are the things that they are concerned about. So I'm just going to do one more slide. You need to be entrepreneurial. It's not going to land in your lap. If you don't have the opportunity to do it through teaching, you need to work out where are the forums where researchers and practitioners get to engage. Are there certain conferences where that happens? Are there research days that an institution runs and policymakers, etc., come there? Yeah, if you're starting research and it's, say, for example, around TB diagnosis, to approach the managers of the TB service and indicate that you would like to engage with them to get their insights in terms of ensuring that the research questions address issues which they see as problems, and to see if one can continue engaging with them throughout the research process. I mean, clearly the issue that you've got to watch out for there is not to jeopardize your independence. To use networks, whether they're social networks, you have a friend who went to university with someone who's now quite senior, whatever, you try to use those networks to meet up with people, but also senior colleagues. If you know that senior colleagues are, I mean, senior colleagues should be offering and saying, look, you've been doing relevant research on this, I'm going, would you like to come with? But otherwise, you say, can I come along? Please, will you introduce me, etc. The other thing is not to put all your eggs in one basket, that there is quite high staff turnover in many health departments. So don't focus just on one person. You might be introduced to one person, but over time develop relationships with as many as you can. Last thing, you do need to develop your skills, invest in those relationships, but sometimes you may not be the best messenger, and then you've got to look for someone who is already well established and is regarded, is trusted, is regarded as credible to convey the message for you. It helps if they are, if it is one of the ways that it's very helpful to have somebody who is regarded as very credible as a co-researcher and co-author on things. I'm going to end there, and basically, as I say, this will be uploaded and there are references, etc. And I'm going to stop talking and let's see if there are questions, comments, and hopefully Torhilde will help with this. But thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope it wasn't too practical and applied. Yeah. How do we identify the relevant policymakers to whom we should hand over our policy brief? Well, it depends what the focus of it is. As I say, if it's about the dispensing of antiretroviral medicines, then it's the people who are in charge, the managers of the antiretroviral program, the main pharmacists, etc. It really is very issue specific, but it is, you need to identify if it's more at a macro sort of policy level. You need to identify who is it that has the power or is responsible for making this policy, but also at decentralized levels. Who's responsible for this program? Who's responsible for implementing this? And the problem then is to be able to meet with those particular people. But I think particularly at a health service level, it's entirely possible for you to approach those health managers and try to set up a meeting, particularly if you're doing it at an early stage of the research, and just say, look, we're wanting to do this research, we just wanted to get a sense of what you think about it, etc., etc. Are these the key issues? That sort of thing. All right, so to Hilda.
Yes. Hi. Many thanks, Di. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. There were a few questions that came in beforehand, but I think that you have addressed those. Like, for example, one was, what is the reason for the gap between research and policy in the first place? And I think you have addressed that, for example, by mentioning the role of stakeholders, for example, to explain why this may be a messy process, but not a linear process. And if I can ask just one quick question.
Sure.
Yes, regarding the point of making findings accessible, I wonder whether there might be an unfulfilled demand or demand for good quality systematic reviews papers that gather research findings on particular topics in a way that would be helpful for policymakers. Would you think that is that so?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that, you know, the systematic reviews and synthesis of information, because systematic reviews are often seen as, okay, if it doesn't meet this absolute gold standard Cochrane, you know, then in terms of how the research was done, then it's you know, you can't look at it, or you can't consider it as part of the, and what often happens then is that you get to the end of the systematic review and the bottom line is, well, actually there's no good research out there on the issue, so we can't say anything, which I don't think is necessarily the case. But with synthesis of looking, being and doing it in a systematic way, and saying, look, okay, what is all the information and the evidence that is out there, and looking at, you know, in a very balanced way, and saying, look, some of the research says this, and it's in these kind of contexts, and some of it says that, etc., etc. Those kind of syntheses of knowledge are incredibly important to policymakers, because, you know, then they know from the outset what the different views and approaches and the breadth of the evidence. They get a sense of that. It's very definitely something that is, and it's being given much more emphasis. If you have a look in some of the the policy, the research to policy literature now, there's quite a lot of emphasis on the importance of synthesizing knowledge and making that available to policymakers.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So yes, as I said, I think you have covered the questions that came before and the ones that came now alongside the talk.
Yes.
So if there are there any more? So if you would write your question in the chat box. But if
Or
not,
a comment.
or any comments at all?
Because you might disagree, you might, or you might have some right ideas.
Yes, to share. That's great.
Yeah.
But
Hello.
Yes.
hello.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Diane, for this presentation. Very interesting. I'm a social researcher, junior researcher, and I have a question about so part of the presentation, which is when you to value your research, which is based on the legitimacy and the relationship of trust that you build with the policymakers. I don't necessarily have much experience about it, but from my impression, we know where we work on a project and move to another, etc. And so where we have the component of time, and where we are very limited in terms of our interaction with the policymakers, and this capacity to build this relationship over time. I was wondering how you went around that, your experience.
Okay, so do you mean when you're moving from one project to another and a different group of policymakers, or is it more about balancing the demands on time and that sort of thing?
So moving, yeah, exactly, from another research project, maybe this is more in
Look, I mean, it is something that is really, it's a lot easier if you've got a particular niche area and you're working. So a lot of my research has been around healthcare financing. And, that and some issues around the price of medicines. There have been a couple of key areas that I've worked in. And that made it much easier because you were constantly working or engaging with the same group of people or groups of people. If you're shifting from, quite diverse things, it's very, very difficult. And I think there one has to link up with others who spend all their time working in that field and rely on them to have those relationships with people in at the policy level, because it's just impossible if you say, for example, you focused on economic evaluations, but sometimes it's looking at HIV, and sometimes it's looking at some chronic or coronary artery bypass grafts or things like that. You can't possibly be expected to engage with or build relationships with all the policymakers. So I must say that I think that actually, if you want to be someone who really influences policy yourself, then you need to have a niche area and you need to invest. Otherwise, if the main skill actually that I think is the most valuable, particularly if you're working with others who have contacts, if they're the knowledge brokers, if they're the ones that engage with the policymakers, the skill that I think is the most important, identify what the key messages are from your research. And as I say, that's that sort of elevated test of if you've got 1 or 2 minutes with the minister, what do you want him or her to know about the research? Being able to get those serious messages. And somehow I think it would be easier for your generation because you're the generation of tweeters. So I think you probably have a head start in being able to work out how to convey things simply. Okay, from your own experience, are there instances? Oh, sorry, there's a couple, there's a whole range of them.
Okay, thank
are there
you.
instances where, okay, has been sidelined? Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, it can happen for many reasons. It can happen because other stakeholders have more power in the policy process, you know, where they've got vested interests. It can be that policymakers don't, you're not conveying the message in a way that persuades them that it actually helps address a problem they have. But yes, very definitely. Yeah.
I have one question here that I see. We have little time left though, but
Yes.
I have one question that maybe we can address quickly. How do we balance the need to do really cutting-edge novel research and policy work that may sometimes be not as novel, but highly relevant and important? So how do we balance this? Can we?
So just, sorry, I was just skimming some of the chat box. Sorry, say that again? Just...
Yes. How do we balance the need to do really cutting-edge novel research and policy work that may sometimes be not as novel, but highly relevant and important?
Yeah. You know, I think ultimately, I think we need innovation, we need development, etc. And when I said earlier, I think that there's very little health economics research that is truly not policy relevant. But it is at that kind of very innovative, developing new methodological approaches, etc., etc. But ultimately, those new methodological approaches can be applied to addressing key policy issues. But I think it really, you know, it's not one or the other that one has to focus on. It does depend on where your interests and your expertise lie. Whether one focuses more on trying to do quite a lot at the methodology and innovation level, or whether your kind of big desire in life is to change the world in terms of the research, you know, that can change things on the ground. So I think, but yes, you know, that's why it is important to sort of have some modest expectations, and particularly if really the thing that makes you most excited in life is methodological innovation. You know.
I think you answered that very well. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions, and I think we are out of time now. So, Ty, many thanks for sharing your expertise, knowledge with us, and for your very clear and informative presentation. I found the examples and the practical tips very helpful. And I see that the importance of making findings accessible and delivering key messages that are actionable can hardly be overstated. So many thanks to all of you who attended this first webinar and for your questions. So we now come to the end of the webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.